Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming. My name is Rob Eyler. I'm an economist, and I want to thank AFWD for having me do this for Lassen County today. What we're going to do in the next little while here is we're going to go through the macro situation in terms of how an economist would look at the national and to a certain extent the international picture, but mainly the national and then the state level and then ultimately the local level, including Lassen County, and talk about some of the latest data that might help decision making, but just also provide context for thinking about the next couple of years. The first stop we're going to make is where economists are sort of focusing their energy in the short term. And just as a quick sidebar, please put any questions you have in the chat and we will get to them at the end. Don't hesitate to type those in. Make sure if you have questions as we go to type them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. We have a new administration. That administration is coming with a lot of spending ideas, a lot of ways of helping the economy recover, not only in the short term, but also in the medium to long. And in the sum of parts, we should expect a lot of spending in 2021 by the federal government. Now, a lot of the concern is going to be whether or not it should be mainly focused on fiscal stimulus round 3 and more transfer payments to households, help for businesses, and sort of an array of recovery items rather than investment, meaning that the government is going to pay for jobs and the creation of more infrastructure or other goods and services in the economy that tend to have longer lasting effects. Well, we certainly have had another round of fiscal stimulus, and those checks are starting to hit. And some of that has actually helped at least bridge the gap between the social constraints laid on by a lot of the parts of the country in December, another round of lost jobs, which we'll see in just a minute, and people getting by. There's a lot of political pressure to do a third round of stimulus with the idea that coupled with the recovery momentum we already had in place and now that we have vaccines moving around potentially more quickly, you put all that together and we have enough recovery momentum, we won't have to do a fiscal stimulus number 4. And so the current Biden economic plan is really these 3 steps: recover, invest, and then redistribute income for equity purposes. Keep that linear model in mind. Recovery first, then invest longer term versus shorter term. But ultimately, one of the goals of the Biden administration is to increase the tax rates, redistribute that income to help our lower wage folks, because that unfortunately is the group that is going to see the longer lasting effects from this recession. So much of the economic damage has been borne by not only our lower wage groups, but those industries that hire at lower wage, lower skill levels, and really, unfortunately, are the entry level ways in which a lot of us transition from one job to another because it's relatively easy to get a job, generally speaking, in those industries. Well, let's first start by looking at the ways people become unemployed. This is at the national level from January 2007 forward on a monthly basis to just December 2020. So this is very new data. Most people became unemployed initially in a temporary way when the COVID-19 recession hit. And you can see how atypical this is for the evolution of the temporarily unemployed over the last 13 years. Notice that spike on the far right-hand side. Well, sorry, here is the Great Recession and the permanent unemployment situation over the last 13 years. And you can easily see the Great Recession, that big blue hill about a quarter of the way in the moving from left to right on the page. But notice, unfortunately, on the right-hand side, the current recession we're still in is increasing in the number of people who've now been permanently displaced from their jobs. So one of the critical issues that economists are watching is how much larger that's going to get versus the temporary portion and how that is growing versus the growth of jobs, because the supposition was is those temporarily unemployed people would both become permanently unemployed because they would not, unfortunately, get the jobs back that they expected to get back, and also they would get a job. Now, the other ways that you become unemployed are you quit, or you finish a temporary job and now you're looking for work, you quit, you re-enter the labor force, which is an intriguing dynamic in this recession because we know due to a lack of childcare and a lack of schools being open, parents have decided to walk away from looking for a job or from working in the short term. Now those folks are starting to come back in the labor force. And then also new entrants, college and high school graduates who are now looking for a job. The larger that rainbow portion of this graph becomes on the far right-hand side, the more concerns we have over a speedy recovery. Well, let's now look and see the industries that were hurt by this. I alluded to the idea that lower wage, lower skilled jobs, kind of entry-level jobs, generally speaking, are the ones that were most hurt by what we saw in terms of the dynamics of the recession. Well, here's April 2020 at the national level, and these data are looking back 1 year and saying what % of jobs were either gained or lost looking back same month 1 year ago. So April 2019 to April 2020 in this bar. This is where the national economy saw the most hurt right away. Bars and restaurants, food services, drinking places is the fancy term. About almost 50% of the folks who were working April 2019 did not have a job in that industry April 2020, meaning there was almost a contraction of half the people. Hotels, over 40%. So you may remember, though it might seem like a long time ago, April was really a damaging labor market month, and we still are dealing with that damage as we speak. But by the time November rolled around, we had seen some recovery. However, in places like hotels or in businesses like hotels, the recovery was not as strong as in other industries, nor was the damage as bad in other industries as it was in the hotel industry. Restaurants and bars had come back because we'd had seen social constraints somewhat lift across the country, but still some damage there. In December, we unfortunately gave some of that momentum back. So what these numbers are, again, the way to read this, on the far right-hand side for hotel and motel workers, 32 out of 100 people who had a job December 2019 were out of work December 2020 with respect to having a job in hotels. So that, another way of seeing that is that there is a contraction of almost a third of the hiring capacity in that industry. And whether or not it will come back or not is one of the biggest questions going forward. But this kind of shows you the distribution of the labor market damage and also the labor market recovery so far by industry at the national level. Another way to look at recovery is the total number of people employed and what it looks like versus another recession. So I get a lot of questions about how to compare the current situation we're in to previous recessions. This recession here is different because of the way we got into it, but also the original prediction is that we would have a very short-lived recession and ultimately a very quick recovery. Well, the recession is likely to be relatively short. I'll come back and talk about this later in terms of it being a declared time frame, but the recovery period is the one that's the longer issue. So here is the Great Recession from its beginning at the American economy in November 2007 to when the number of people working in the United States got back to the same number of people as November 2007. That was 76 months later. So 6 years, 4 months later, we finally got all those people, or the total number of people working again, same level, which ultimately is kind of like the same capacity level in the economy. And we sort of missed those 6 years worth of growth. So that is a long, drawn out so-called Great Recession and ultimately long recovery period. Here is the COVID-19 period after 12 months. So notice how quick we fell, how quick we bounced back up to relatively good levels of employment. And it also underscores the idea that being around 93, 94% of employment from 12 or 14 months ago is a really tough situation, and economies generally don't like to linger around that level. And that's why the Great Recession was called that, because we stayed in that bottom of that blue bowl for a long time. That black line curling is a problem. So originally, it was even 3 months ago, we looked like we were on a nice trajectory up toward that red dotted line. That's where we need to get back to. But that curl of the black line means we're starting to slow and see some slowing of momentum, if not giving back some, as we just saw in the previous graph. So we're watching these kind of data closely, but if one thing you want to think about as far as monitoring as a snapshot where the American economy is going, this is a good way of thinking about how close we are to getting back to square. Now, our financial markets have had a wild ride the last few months and really the last 10 years, but I'm going to try to show you this to you over 20 years. This is the S&P 500 on a monthly basis. These shaded areas are recessions. So the dot-com recession, sort of this, what now is a very slow movement down. You can't look at it day to day. You have to think on a month by month basis. It was a relatively slow ride down to the bottom. Then we had a nice ride during the first decade of the new millennium. Then we had a hard fall as the Great Recession unfolded. We fell to that 735 number. We've been on a long bull market ever since. So the equity markets have been very frothy, generally speaking, since 2010, with some ups and downs, but they've recovered. You'll notice the sharp V on the far right-hand side before that third shaded area, that went down to 2652. That's just March and April 2020. And by the end of 2020, we were at 3690 on the S&P on a monthly average basis. So we've seen amazing recovery from the initial downturn from this recession. We expect the recession to be declared over, which I'll reiterate in just a little while. By the end of that, we're going to say kind of in a backcasting way that sometime in the first or second quarter of 2021, we believe the recession actually ended quarter 4 2020. The investors remain very confident in terms of continued recovery. So everything I told you, low interest rates, the vaccines running around, providing more relief in terms of knocking down those caseloads, all that put together is giving investors a lot of confidence. Well, low interest rates we thought would also drive a lot more use of debt. Here is household mortgage debt over the last 17 years on a quarterly basis. And you can easily see here the hill running up to the top of the housing market into about mid 2008, and then the fall down as people lost their houses, thus lost the debt that were with those houses. And we went down to a bottom, and it took us a long time, following very much the labor market recovery. But the evolution of debt, and these are inflation adjusted numbers, the evolution of the debt has been much more slow over this last decade. And a lot of economists expected a quick jump up of people using debt to get through and out of the current situation, but still basically maintaining the same lifestyle. That has not happened. Two major reasons on that. One is that we've seen people refinance, so they're restructuring their debt. And also federal stimulus or fiscal stimulus has provided some relief versus using credit cards or other debt instruments to get by. But this is just household debt. So now let's walk through those other debt instruments. Here's home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit cards. This is where we thought we'd see a lot of dynamics. Haven't really seen much happen here. Again, the fiscal stimulus is helping people not have to make that buildup of debt decision. Student loans and other lending vehicles. So you add all this up, and the things that sort of came together negatively for the American economy and forced a big downturn in 2008 and 9 do not look like they're there as a result or before this recession began. So that's good. It should keep us from feeling a lot of that additional financial market damage alongside of the labor market damage, what an economist would call financial problems versus real problems. That's something to watch going forward, because 2021 or 2020 and 2022 should test the housing markets based on what the true recovery momentum becomes. This morning, we saw the IMF provide its forecast for the global economy, including the United States, and it sees the United States growing relatively quickly in 2021, albeit from a smaller base number in 2020 because there was a contraction of the amount of income we made after inflation in 2020. And then 2022 moderating that growth to something that's a little bit more pre-COVID on an annual basis. But if you look at these major economies of the world, even though you don't see China here, look at these major economies, all of them have positive growth. China also has a positive growth forecast. Things are looking good. And if you couple it with everything else I said, we just have to get through the next couple of months and hope the vaccines and our sort of social interactions both work with each other to reduce the caseloads in such a way that we can see all the social restrictions move and thus recover in full. The recovery's on in California and in Lassen County also. So what I'm going to do over the next few slides is I'm going to walk you through the data that best describes the California economy and where it is right now, but also Lassen County. Here's California, Lassen County, and Sacramento County, just to provide you with some contrasts geographically, but just also different sizes of places. So you can see that in Lassen County, the unemployment rate is 7.1%. SAC, it's about 7.9 at the end of December. And the unemployment rate for California is about 8.8. So Lassen County is doing relatively well versus the state on average, and actually a little bit better than Sacramento. It's a smaller place, obviously. In rural California, most of the counties have a very similar look and feel. The one data point to point out and to watch is labor force. So notice that and I should be a little bit more explanatory here. The negative numbers represent the changes from 1 year ago in December. So the negative 3.9 that is associated to the negative 380 people is the percentage change in the number of people either looking for work or working in Lassen County versus December 2019. So there has been a loss of folks actively being a part of the labor market. Whether that is due to retirements, people who have chosen to walk away because of childcare needs or some other reasons, or they've moved away from Lassen County is the big open question about the dynamics of the labor market in the last few months, because we've seen that number go up and down, up and down. Typically in recession, you see it go down, meaning it becomes more negative. The reason? More retirements and people basically walk away, they become discouraged with the market. When these numbers get closer to zero and we don't have negative changes and the unemployment rate is falling simultaneously, that means the labor market is moving more toward full recovery. So watch those data. Same data for California we saw before with the national level. I did not take the seasonality out of this because I think it's good to just sort of see the bumps and clunks along the way, especially in the local markets in California. This is the state overall. Same time frame, November 2007 forward. Long bowl, shorter in time than the national level, but still a long time period, about 56 months to get back the jobs we lost. And here is the COVID-19 movement for California. So same V shape, that same kind of curl that we've seen at the national level, though it's been more abrupt and more recent. The national level was already starting to fade a little bit. California really hit hard the last 2 months. Same thing though. We need that black line to move toward the dotted line, the red dotted line, and that's going to mean true statewide recovery. Now, same deal here also, looking at industries. Notice, sorry, this is April 2020, leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, other services, hair salons, nail salons, a bunch of different sort of unaffiliated industries that would fall in these other buckets otherwise. Those were the two most hurt in California. Why? Tourism areas. We had social restrictions on our ability to go to hair salons and nail salons and skin salons initially, and thus we saw those jobs cut very rapidly. Watch this over the next few months. Here's May, June, July, August, September, October, November. So that nice steady thing that economists are looking for when they're looking for labor market recovery month on month, getting back to the red dotted line, just like in the last graph, trying to get rid of the problems and ultimately get people back to work. Well, there's December. Unfortunately, just like at the national level, we gave back some of that labor market momentum. About 3 out of 10 people don't have a job that had one last December in bars, restaurants, and hotels. About 1 out of 5 in those other services. In farming, which is on the far left-hand side, about 13 out of 100 people who had a job 1 year ago. But December's kind of a strange farming month in California. It's the middle there where we had a lot of issues, including fires that exacerbated some of the ways that we looked at hiring people for harvest this year in California. Otherwise, those industries have slowly started to come back pretty much across the board, which is good. What that means is that the labor market in California is getting there. It's just going to take some time. Well, the Department of Finance does a forecast that goes alongside of the governor's budget every year, and that's what this next graph is to show you from 2005 forward, using the year 2007 as the index base, what the evolution of jobs are going to be for the next few years, but really where we've gone. So there is the evolution of the number of people that have worked or had a job in California. The downturn here, there's the Great Recession. You see it go down and end, then start to pick back up. Long positive growth in labor markets over the next decade, peaking January 2020, falling down hard in 2020. Here is that recession, and then smoothly going up with recovery momentum all the way to the end of 2024. But the two ideas here are one, like I said before, we're probably going to have the current recession declared over. The fourth quarter of 2020, we'll do that this year at some point. But the transition into this recovering economy is going to take some time. It could be the end of 2024 before we fully recover, or 5 years total in terms of jobs we had in California at the beginning of 2020 and getting back to that same volume of jobs. That means that across California, the jobs evolution is going to be slow and steady, but hopefully is going to remain positive. And this forecast is predicated upon the idea that everything I've told you before continues to move forward positively. If we see caseloads rise again for some other reason, or we don't get enough vaccines done and people get a little bit more loosey-goosey about how we interact with each other and spread the COVID virus some more, those are going to lead to social problems if they turn into healthcare problems. And that's the key. Though that same domino effect is still in play here until further notice. So all this is on the idea that we are going to see a smooth, continuous recovery period. All right, now let's look at Lassen County and what happened in the Great Recession. Lassen County has a lot more seasonality in it. I smoothed some of that seasonality. It really doesn't change the story. The Great Recession didn't hit Lassen County until about 2009 or 10, and then it really hammered the economy, and it basically hasn't regained those lost jobs to date. Here is the Great Recession here. Here is the COVID-19 recession. You can actually see that on the far right-hand side as well, because the recovery period from the Great Recession never ended. But the good thing is, which is kind of wild, is that in terms of January 2020, which is the starting point of that black line, Lassen County had actually recovered already but then got hammered the last couple of months. And so that's something to watch going forward is, does that black line V back up toward the red dotted line in Lassen County, or does it continue to kind of slide down and then curl around and then start moving up to the red line? So in one of the very few instances around California, Lassen County kind of had originally a true V-shaped recovery. You can actually see the letter V almost perfectly in that black line, but the last few months have not helped. For Lassen County, here's the industrial composition over these last 9 months. April and May were tough months for Lassen County. We just saw that in the last graph. June didn't change things that much. In fact, maybe exacerbated it in a couple of industries. It was really July, August, and September that we saw some real comeback, and into October, then November, and then there's December giving some of that momentum back. But retail has been really hammered. Construction has been hammered. You can see those in the sort of 1/3 of the way moving from left to right. And I'm sorry, some of those percentage changes are kind of clouded by the bars. Leisure and hospitality about 30% down. Those are not good numbers in terms of foundational jobs in Lassen County. So one of the things about job recovery is, in some cases you might have, again, a lot of jobs coming back, but do you have specific industries that are still having problems? And that's where economic development resources should focus their energy. That's what's powerful, I hope, about breaking the data down like this is, while I go back up, let's just look quickly at the last graph. This graph may help you say, well, look, if we assume that the last couple of months are anomalous because of the social restrictions coming back, we should be good after they go away because we had a nice V-shaped recovery. Well, if you go back here, that V-shaped recovery encompasses this entire time period, but the last few months, there's still 2 or 3 industries here that have been hurting the whole time. You got to think that's where economic development resources are absolutely necessary. Housing markets have actually held up across California. Here's Lassen County compared to a bunch of different places, most of it around the Sacramento or, let's say, foothills area, and a little sprinkle of northeastern California otherwise. But over the last 12 months, seen about just under 5% growth of Lassen County's home prices, and comparatively speaking, relatively decent growth, though other places, specifically Sacramento, have been absolutely red hot. Nevada County is kind of funny, but a lot of that is expats from Sacramento and other parts of the Bay Area coming toward the foothills and wanting to get closer to Tahoe. At least we're hearing that out of our real estate professionals in places like El Dorado and Nevada County. But some of that's going to start spilling over into places like Placer and Lassen and moving north and northeast. The key is whether or not this changes the way, again, we look at equity. I told you earlier that the Biden White House is very focused on changing the equity conditions, especially because this recession has hit lower wage workers harder. Housing equity is another thing to watch, because all kinds of conversations about that throughout California before the recession. It's coming back. So positive for homeowners now, not great for people trying to buy a home at lower to middle wage and income levels. The forecast also looks very positive. These are the major metropolitan, quote unquote, areas. Some of these are not that major or metropolitan, but it basically shows you the spread around California and what the current forecast is coming out of Zillow. And most housing economists are not much different no matter who they are, looking at a very robust year, 2021. Well, that robust year, 2021, is something, again, that has kind of a double-edged sword to it. One is, it's great, again, if you own a home. We don't see a repeat of the Great Recession in housing for right now. And there's no reason with low interest rates and decent recovery momentum we'll actually get there. The problem, it's making it more affordable for folks at lower and middle wage and income levels. Here's another way of looking at that issue with the differences between high income and low income workers. The Biden campaign talked a lot about a K-shaped recovery. This picture is something that typifies that. Harvard University is in a partnership with the Gates Foundation to gather data together, collect it in ways to so-called track the recovery, and this is called tracktherecovery.org is the total database. If you're a data junkie about what's going on with the recovery period, including COVID cases, go to tracktherecovery, all one word.org, and you can get nothing but a huge dump truck of data. These data are through October 22, and it shows you for California that high wage workers, there wasn't much of a change in terms of the number of people that were employed at high wages, which for national comparisons are anything over $60,000 a year, which isn't that much in California, but again, for national comparisons, basically flat, way down initially, slow climb back up, basically flat versus January 2020. For low wage workers, maybe 28% down in terms of how many of those workers have a job now that had one in January. So that split is a big policy issue for the Biden White House. Now, what that means ultimately is it probably means a lot of pressure to increase taxes, but in the short term, what it means, rising government demand for social services, a lot of pressure on our local nonprofits, a lot of pressure on our multifamily landowners if they are renting their spaces to folks at relatively low incomes. Watch for either an exodus, real pressure on cash flows. Hopefully you're already working with some of those people to maintain your own cash flow, but just watch for that sort of dynamic in Lassen County for rentals. The ability of local businesses to come back depends somewhat on the local labor force. And if this change in California turns into an outmigration of lower wage workers, there's going to be a big scramble to find people to work, even though you'd think that's kind of counterintuitive. Like, this guy's crazy. That many people out of work, why would it be tough to find somebody? It actually is. If you talk to people on the street in your local business, they'll tell you that if they've remained open, it's been tough to hire people because in many ways, these households are affected differently. And lower wage households might have somebody who's out of work, somebody who has a job, and the sum of the parts aren't working. So they're thinking very deeply about leaving the area. And when people start talking about leaving the area, it's harder to find workers. Small businesses have had a really tough go. This is looking at California overall, and that same database tracks through a bunch of big data links and databases otherwise, trying to cobble together, can we track the number of small businesses that remain open? And again, for national comparison purposes, these businesses are basically 500 workers or less, which might seem, again, crazy. For California, most of that's going to happen with 25 people or less, but it could be as many as 50% or as much as 50% of those businesses that are either in bars, restaurants, or hotels that have closed as of December 31 that were open January 1, 2020. The problem with these data, and they'll tell you this, the people that run the database, they don't know how many of these are permanently or temporarily closed. Are they closed for social restriction reasons, or are they closed because they're not going to be in business anymore? That's something to watch closely. So locally, from an economic development standpoint, it's an imperative that you monitor what's going on with business licenses. What does it look like from a storefront standpoint? Does it look like there's economic activity, especially as social restrictions lift and we get more people on the move? If you don't see a lot more obvious supply side activity, businesses open, businesses advertising, vibrance around the business community, your chambers are a great way of following that also. Keep that in mind in terms of really monitoring how true these data are about permanent closure. And you can see that split there. And we're worried about loss of capacity, the rise of local costs of living, and then ultimately, will we lose businesses because the costs of operation are going to rise to continue in a post-COVID format? This is one of the biggest issues, especially for leisure and hospitality businesses, bars, restaurants, hotels, event centers, anywhere where you have a gathering of people. You're going to have to change the way you do business. That change may be too costly to stay in business for some businesses. Let's look now at Lassen County. The last data slide I have is to talk about the population evolution in Lassen. Here are births versus deaths. So one of the things that's been true about rural California is it's gotten older. And as it's gotten older, you have, unfortunately, more people passing on versus people being born. But even then, the local workforce is really not going to be enhanced by a lot of new families and having businesses. We really need working families in local areas that are ready to work and have kids ready to go to school. The population evolution, unfortunately, does point toward lower school attendance when it's dropping, and also more social services demand, depending if we're trading older for younger workers. There's net foreign change, not a whole lot here, but to show some statewide comparisons, these data are there. But this, the more important one's the next one, and this is the movement of people to and from Lassen County to other parts of the United States, and that's this one. So when people come and go, it changes the population locally. You can see between 2008, beginning of the housing crisis, basically through 2019, we saw a lot of people on average leaving. In 2020, the first 6 months, which is really what this shows, because these data are fiscal years and we have it all the way through June 30th, 2020, smaller outmigration, which may mean that people are actually coming against the people that are leaving in net. But either way, this is the total population change in Lassen County over the last 20 years, more or less. And you can see over the last 10 or 15, it's been generally negative year on year on year. Again, not anomalous for rural California, but something to watch, trading younger folks with families for older residents and what that does to the dynamics of the local communities and ultimately to public finance. So what are we watching going forward? Well, one of the things we kind of alluded to, but I didn't talk too deeply on, is lower interest rates. We should expect lower interest rates to continue. Even though economic growth will happen, it probably happen at such a slow and steady pace that it'll take some time for interest rates to really lift. But watch for that going forward as a sign that we actually are having recovery. Hopefully we'll not get interest rates rising for risk reasons because something goes wrong. And we might get that if we see COVID-19 cases rise again very quickly. Housing prices have increased and they look really good going forward. And maybe because we're seeing more of a dispersion around California rather than concentration in our urban areas for the time being, but don't expect that to last forever. Our urban areas are still going to be vibrant places and they're going to figure out what to do. The key is whether or not employers are okay with people working at distance, if that's possible. So that, again, that dispersion is going to depend a lot on how we're going to stay employed with respect to where we live and work. That K-shaped versus V-shaped recovery, how lower wage workers continue to unfortunately see a tough job market, and how that affects taxes, spending at the federal level and the state level, and how that ultimately affects businesses. We think it's going to hurt urban areas faster than suburban and rural, but watch for that dynamic evolve as time moves on. All that kind of boils into watching our public sector. The California economy, the state of California in terms of its financial situation looks better than it did 6 months ago. Still not out of the woods, doesn't see itself getting out of the woods for another few years. But if we don't see some real corner turns here pretty quick, it's in our cities and counties that we're going to see some damage remain. So we're hoping to see some fiscal stimulus that actually provides money directly to cities and counties. We're hearing some rumblings about that in terms of another full package. But for the time being, it's really this sort of balancing act of getting the economy into recovery mode and ultimately getting our cities and counties back off the ground. And managing debt then becomes one of the biggest issues. We don't want that recovery to be driven by household debt rising. We don't want to have our cities and counties scrambling to try to just balance budgets. We don't want our states to do the same. But at the same time, we've got to watch and make sure the federal government doesn't, in a sense, mortgage itself for the short-term benefit that has absolutely no long-term gain. So we're watching a lot of those thought patterns go around Congress and also our state, county, and city chambers to make sure that this recovery is enhanced through policy, but does not become dependent on policy. And that's a key idea going forward. And managing debt is going to be a primary issue in terms of making that corner to get turned. So I'm going to look at the chat now. Thank you again for coming today. I don't see anything in the chat. So if I'm going to give it a minute, and if I don't see anything, then I will sign off. But folks, if you did make it today, I really appreciate it. And this recording will be available as well as the slides if you want to go back and reference it. Thank you again. And hopefully this year is going to be a good one in Lassen County. Okay, take care.